Okay. Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Beer Ladies podcast, where we bring you a weekly dose of beer-related conversations. I'm your host, Thandi, and with me are my friends and co-hosts, Christina and Lisa.
Hey!
Yeah. Say hi, guys. Awesome. Now, for a quick bit of context and an intro to the podcast. This idea was formed and born the way that all the best ideas are, over a few too many beers on a staycation. So throughout COVID and lockdown, a few good things happened, and one of them was that our Beer Ladies meetup group went from sort of a monthly casual brewery tour group to a thriving online community full of interesting conversations, and we wanted to share some of that with you. So in this podcast, or in this episode really, we're going to head straight into some seriously spooky season history, right? We're going to be looking at the connection between alewives and witches, and why the typical kind of rumors of stereotypical witches are not really as closely linked to alewives as we thought, or are they? We're gonna dig into it. But before we get stuck into that, right, let's go around the table and let's go with what are we drinking tonight, ladies? Christina, shall we start with you? Tell us a little bit about you and what beer you've got tonight.
So I'll start with my beer. So I am drinking Zither. It's a Vienna lager from Dewdrop Brew House. It's in Kill. So I'm really excited about this. Yeah, I like the branding. It's really cool. I just ordered a 12-pack mixed case from them, and it came super fast. So I was really excited. I ordered it on Saturday, and it got here today, which I think is pretty awesome. And so far, it's really good.
Oh, yeah, look at that color. My goodness.
It's really nice. Like it's everything I want a Vienna lager to be. I'm very happy with it. And I had high expectations. And
Vienna lagers are such a nice style though. And it was hot today, so that was really, that's a good one.
I didn't think I liked lager until I went to Prague last year. And now I'm just obsessed with lagers.
Ah, yes.
Now what they need to do is get some Vienna lager at the one good Mexican restaurant I finally found in Dublin. That would just make it perfection, a Vienna lager. But we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in a future episode.
Awesome.
Oh, yeah. Oh, right. Who am I? Ha.
Yes. Let's hear it.
So why you should listen to me.
Especially on these history episodes, right?
Right. Like, who's this broad? So I have a PhD in history. I'm originally from America, and I moved to Ireland to do my doctorate. My degree is in medieval history in particular, but I do research much more modern than that. So since I completed my PhD, I've been researching and writing a book about beer in Ireland, the women who brewed it, the people who drank it, sort of the clash between cultures, colonization and its impact, those sorts of things. I also run a blog called Brachiotrix, and I write particularly about women in beer history. And about today's topic, I wrote a long and meandering post about this a couple years ago, and it is a rant that is very dear to my heart. So I'm looking forward to having a go at the History Channel.
Oh, fantastic. And we'll link that article in the show notes below and in the descriptions below. So all of that will be available to everybody out there in podcast and YouTube land. Okay, Lisa, your turn. Tell us about you and tell us about your beer.
Sure, I will. I'll start with the beer first because that is easy and delightful. I'll have better lighting next time, but I have 4 provinces, Gabfluch. Did I say it right, Christina? You've lived here much longer, so maybe. But 4 provinces, they're a local Dublin brewery. I like that they have everything in English and Irish. It's very, very cool, and it's a dark mild, which, as anyone who starts to listen to this podcast regularly will know, I love dark milds. They are my jam. They make me very, very happy. But
indeed,
as far as why you should listen to me, so I'm also a transplant. I think that's one of the fun things about our group is we have women from all over the world. We have women who have grown up here in Dublin, all over the place. We're all sort of brought together by just this drink we love. It's so much fun, and we have such a good time. But I am a BJCP judge, so I can judge your homebrew competition beers that you enter. I will tell you that you either got your sanitation wrong or your temperature wrong, because it's almost always one or the other. But
That's
try
true.
to give you constructive feedback. But like Christina, I also come at this from a beer history angle. I used to write a regular column for Serious Eats on beer history. My academic background is as an archaeologist, but I know nobody wanted to hear about the trade of amber in the late Bronze, early Iron Age, even though it's actually really interesting. I swear. But
I'm sure there's a market for this somewhere.
Oh, absolutely. This is why I'm not in academia. Yes. But I also have a huge interest in folklore and fake lore, especially. But I love anything to do with ghosts, witches, demons. I collect ghost stories, all of that kind of thing. But I especially love, too, where we can debunk something, because I love the stories and how they evolve and what they tell us. But I also love where we can say, nah, that ain't it, kid. So that's where I come in this. I both love the lore and also want to be like, the real story's more interesting. So that's why you should listen to me.
Really, really good.
Back to you.
Yeah, back to me. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what beer I'm drinking. I have got a Hop On from Hope. So Hope is also, Hope is also local to Dublin. They're in the north of Dublin, and this is a Hop On, and it's a session IPA. And I had actually never tried this one, so I was kind of surprised. You know when you go to the store and you're like, oh man, I've tried everything here. I'm not there yet, but I am in some of the stores around me. But this one snuck up, and pretty chuffed to have found it. And what I do like about it is that since it's our first podcast and since we're all in Dublin, it's got the dart on it, which is our train. It's our train. Even though it says New York on it, which is a little bit bizarre. But yeah, it's my first time, and it is quite beautiful. It's golden.
Oh, I have a fun fact about
hazy.
That beer. Not to hijack,
yes.
but I will
No,
say
tell
it
me.
was the last beer I had on draft before lockdown in a pub, and the first one at the same pub when we went back after lockdown ended. So it was just so happy to have that beer fresh, and hope that they do an amazing job. Love what they do.
Hope do really do some great
really
beers.
Nice.
Yeah.
And I've been meaning to visit their brewery for ages. But yeah, need to. We'll organize a trip.
The beer ladies keep saying we're going to go, and then lockdown happens. And so we're waiting for this to and then we're going.
Yes.
We're going.
Yes, we are absolutely going. Okay, now before we dive right in, I'm going to give you a very quick summary of me. I'm Thandi. I'm from South Africa, not New Zealand, not Australia, not the UK. Although I'm sure the accents are all going to meld in at some stage. I've been in Dublin for 2 years, almost exactly. And before moving here, I used to run a beer blog in South Africa called Craft Geek, and I used to review beers, and I used to also write periodically for the On Tap magazine, which is South Africa's first beer magazine. I've got a particular interest in things like the design and the branding and the labeling and sort of that perception of the beer. Like that really, really interests me. And that's kind of what I like to do. I like to design. I'm a designer by day and a beer person by night. And yeah, that's what I'm hoping to bring. So, are we going to get into it, ladies? Should we have a quick cheers?
We are going to get into it. Here, here.
Yeah. Cheers. Cilantro. Cheers, guys. Cheers to our first podcast episode ever.
Here, here.
All righty. So, the first question that I need to ask on behalf of kind of everybody, what on earth is an alewife, and how are alewives connected to witches?
Or not. We'll let Christina
Or not. So an alewife is a term for a medieval European brewer. It's brewster, alewife, they're all kind of used interchangeably. Particularly because prior to the introduction of hops in many places, we're talking predominantly about ale, even though we were calling it beer history or we're saying beer. We're really talking about ale for the most part in the very early medieval period through the high medieval, into the later medieval when hops start to take more over and we start to see more beer production. But that is very dependent on where you are, because hops are really prevalent in some places pretty early on and not in other places. And then this is a big bone of contention among scholars that people will kind of fight about. So I don't want to get into that too much today. but that's basically what an alewife is.
Right.
And so the reason why we're kind of having this podcast is because there's a thing that's going around, and I'm going to single out the History Channel because I think they need to be more responsible. And they launched this video, which appeared to claim that medieval alewives were the beginning of the modern pop culture witch, that this is where this idea of the pointy hat and the black cat and the broom it's all from medieval alewives. Of course, this is just not at all true.
Now, can I quickly butt in, because I've got to tell you that even I've seen a couple of things about this, and I think there was like quite a long article, and I probably shared this probably a few years ago, where it was literally all of these tropes, right? As you say, well, as you're going to say, hat, cat, broom, cauldron, all come from something to do with alewives. And that was something that I think went viral a few years ago and keeps going viral. So this idea of an alewife, of these women who brewed beer and witches being linked together, is quite a strong thing in society, right, or in culture.
Well, it's really seductive, right? Like this idea that like witches are from alewives, because we know that misogyny is rampant and the patriarchy has really done a great job at destroying any kind of field that was dominated by women and just completely slandering the people that did it. Now, there are links potentially between the people who were accused of witchcraft in the medieval period and alewives, and we're going to talk about that in the next episode. But what we're going to talk about today is Lisa and I are going to go through the black pointy hat, the cat,
right,
and the broom, and we're going to debunk all three of these and how they just do not come from the alewife, unfortunately, or fortunately.
Okay.
And yeah, that's kind of what the premise of today is.
Exactly. Fantastic. And I think it's important to say too, like you see it and at first glance, you're like, oh, it makes sense, of course. Oh, down with the patriarchy. Again, valid reaction. But when you start, unpeeling the layers, you're like, oh, actually, no, there's more to this than meets the eye. So for people who are like, oh, should I feel dumb that I didn't know? No, not at all. This is you have to unpack this hidden history.
Like that was directed straight at me. Thank you, Lisa. I'll take it.
Not at all. Not at all.
No, and especially like it's gotten picked up by a lot of bloggers, and I understand why. Yes. Because if you have big organizations like the History Channel saying this thing, they should be a reliable source. And on this one, unfortunately, they're not. And it is something that, historians such as myself and Lisa and there's a couple others who are just coming out and saying, hi, yeah, no, not true, sorry. But it is completely understandable why people would think it's true.
And I guess it was also seductive during a time when really the patriarchy, or this idea that men have been so misogynistic and so systematically patriarchal throughout society, like it was really something that you almost wanted to believe. You wanted to believe that women didn't succeed, that beer was actually a woman's thing and now it's a man's thing, and this is why. And it was linked to witches, and witches were burned at the stake, and oh my God, beer and women heresy, all of these things. And it is, as you say, Christina, it was kind of seductive. And I think socially the context was right for that narrative to take over.
And especially because there's bits and pieces of truth in all of it, but when you pull it all together, the picture doesn't quite knit together. So that's the problem. It's, you get pieces of knowledge, but again, something like, I have the same problem with the History Channel, where they used to have history on, and now it's this other thing. And
so it was like MTV and music then.
Exactly. Yeah. Completely. Showing my age, but yes.
Even mine. Okay, so which one are we tackling first? Are we going black pointy hat?
Pointy hat.
Awesome.
Yes.
Tell us about pointy hats.
So my first frustration is that this idea that everyone in the medieval period, all these alewives had some like pan-medieval millinery garb, which is just, nonsense. But even going beyond that, we don't see the pointy hat-clad witch until really the 18th century in something called children's chapbooks, which is basically like a pamphlet of tales. So when we'll have the show notes, and I will have in my article some pictures so you can see these images of witches with the pointy hat, etc. But this is the 18th century, so this is way later than these medieval alewives existed. And so I do have several of them cited here. There's some woodcuts and some things there to see. So we do see also Goya, Francisco de Goya. He did a painting called Witch's Flight, and he has sort of pointy hats as well, but these are on male witches, and they did not have a brim. Okay, so we do see that. But again, this is 18th century. This is, 1797, 1798, so much later. When witches are depicted in the medieval period, so when we're talking about the medieval alewife, when we're talking about witches from that time, and even later, even into the early modern period, the early modern period, 1600s and things like that, witches are depicted bareheaded, or they're wearing just the hats of their time, just, a bonnet or whatever was on
the dress
trend.
of their time.
Yes, exactly. Or sometimes they had sort of the medieval hennons and things like that, but nothing, no sort of particular style of pointy black hat. Now you do see the medieval hennon because this was associated with vanity. So there is an idea that perhaps this was used a little bit more, and something kind of like the devil's snare. So when we're talking about this, think Maleficent. The two-pronged sort of pointy hat. So that is kind of common, but that's associated, of course, with vanity. So
yeah, and what's kind of ironic about that is actually they end up looking more like nuns if you look at the one sort of the period, because that's just the medieval dress, and they would have had, again, the different kinds of hair coverings, but fancier ones in this case if they're not bareheaded. And it's interesting that we don't make that connection often, that that's it's effectively just a medieval style of dress. It's not like otherwise unusual, but they would have looked more like your 8th grade teacher, for anyone who went to Catholic school in America, than someone with a pointy hat and a stick and all that.
And that was the scary thing, right? For the medieval, it was it could be anyone.
It could be anyone,
right? It's not this person that comes out in this creepy garb that is basically flashing bright lights at you. I'm a witch with my hat and my it's grandma next door. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of the thing.
Right.
So where did the pointy hat come from?
Exactly.
There's not academic consensus on this.
Okay.
So, which means basically we don't know, or that there's lots of arguments about it. So I can go through a couple of the theories. So one is that they are drawn from classical depictions of the goddess Diana. So who was associated throughout these eras with witchcraft, the goddess of the hunt, and this idea that women would go out at night, ladies of the night, were associated with Diana. Another is, of course, from the medieval hennon. So it was just descended from this medieval hennon, and it eventually became just the one point. Another is that it's an exaggeration of the dunce's cap. I think the more reasonable explanations come from, there's one scholar, Peter Burke, and he postulated that the witch's hat, and indeed the portrayal of the witch at all with a hooked nose, all stem from virulent anti-Semitism. So,
oh, really?
Yeah.
Yes. So he described the witch portrayal as sort of absorbing and amalgamating with contemporary depictions of Jewish people. And he called this the migration of stereotypes. So these things sort of came together to become the modern witch.
I mean, totally as a layman here, but I mean, was anti-Semitism a thing in that time?
Oh, huge.
Really?
Yes. Very badly.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay, I didn't know that.
Anti-Semitism has been around, unfortunately, since the beginning of time.
Yeah,
medieval people, for example, even we'll talk about the Black Death, for example. During the Black Death, they blamed Jewish people for the Black Death and carried out massive pogroms, burning thousands and thousands at the stake. They believed that Jewish people poisoned the wells, and that was what was causing the Black Death, and so they were specifically targeted.
Wow.
It's horrendous.
Oh yeah, it gets
They've
all
never been safe.
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, we could go on and on about just terrible things that
yeah.
have happened pan-European. But it's interesting though too to sort of circle back on two things, because I have to first of all get out my little hobby horse. You know, we're mentioning the Black
Yes.
Death. We're in a
Do
pandemic.
it.
But again, what myth to bust, because I always do it whenever it comes up, is whenever people say ring around the rosy or ring a ring of roses, whichever version you know, is about the Black Death. It's again one of these things people think they know because it makes
Right.
sense, right? But again, the earliest versions of the nursery rhyme are actually, again, sort of either very late 18th or early 19th century even. They don't go back to even the 1666
Oh,
plague. It's
so they
just
weren't around during the time of the
they
plague.
weren't around. It's not a sort of folk memory. And folklorists, I had some wonderful folklore professors as an undergraduate. It would be the first thing they would tell you to be like, popping the bubble now, day one. You're not going to believe this after you come out. But it's, again, people don't know unless you're, you know, in there studying it. It's just not a thing that you find out. So
it always sounds like a
people think they
neat little
know.
anecdote or a neat
Exactly.
little story.
Exactly.
So
It
it's
just
like you
makes
want it to
sense.
fit, you know, you want it to be like an Occam's razor, kind of like,
well,
it's simple, it makes
exactly.
sense, it's perfect, it
Yeah.
works.
Yeah, it's a very sort of X-Files thing too. Like you want to believe because it's so simple, and but it also has the sort of dark. And many, you know, children's rhymes and songs are very dark. Like there's no argument about that. They do have deep, dark roots. Many of them, some not as much as people would like to think. But sort of sidebar there. But then I'm going to loop it back to again the 18th century and thinking about the depictions of witches. I mean, you have this explosion in cheap printing, and so you get the chapbooks, you get broadsides. There are thousands and thousands of broadsides about you know, songs, especially things they would have sold for a penny or less, depicting, you know, witches, depicting the black cats. These all start to come together around this time and kind of the popular consciousness. And again, often some of these things we think of as being kind of folk tales were very much manufactured for cash. There wasn't necessarily this long-standing tradition. Some of them there are. They do draw from
this
some.
This is
but
like
others,
medieval clickbait. That's what it
was.
is.
It
like,
absolutely
that's
was.
Oh yes. Well, I mean, we could.
Yeah.
The whole two-horned Viking thing is a Victorian made-up thing. Like the Vikings were not running around with two horns on their heads, like not even close. Nope. It's just Victorians like to make up stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there were storytellers.
Absolutely.
You know.
Absolutely.
Okay.
They love
fantasy storytellers.
Stuff.
I mean,
absolutely.
But I guess every generation has their stories, right? But I mean, how has this persisted? Like, how has it? How is it?
Because it's seductive, today? Right? People like those kind of stories, and people, unfortunately, don't look too much into them. You know, you hear a story, it sounds plausible, you like it. Yeah. Okay, this is true, and we should be able to trust the people that are telling us these stories.
Still a problem today.
Yes.
And we can't.
Exactly. Yeah. And think about it in like a creepypasta context. These are news stories that even now, some of them are, you know, 5 or 10 years old. People think they have this, we'll say, deeper antiquity, if you like. But you know, someone wrote them once on a lark, and here they are all out now. You know, you hear, you know, black-eyed children and these other things that have sort of leached into the sort of public consciousness. But they're new stories. They're not old stories. Again, sometimes they draw on old forms. And again, we could talk about that for a long time. But it's you know, it's the form. It's not the sort of actual content that's sort of the longer term thing, which is, I think, fascinating. I love the idea of why do these things spread, and sometimes it's not a good thing when they spread. So you have to kind of also have that sort of, what does it mean, and you know, what can we find out about a society when we see this? Again, you're, you know, from an archaeological perspective, you're always trying to unpack, what did it mean? Why did they do this? But sometimes you have to take a step back and say, like, maybe they did just because it looked cool or was fun, or, you know, it doesn't have to have.
Lisa, that's against the primary code of archaeology, which is everything is because of ritual.
Yeah, rituals, reasons. It's like, don't you remember like being in English class and the teacher would say like, you know, the curtains in this book were blue because of her mood and her soul. And I bet it was just a descriptor sometimes. Like we needed to figure out the word count, so we described a curtain color. You know, whatever the case is.
It's the same thing. Like people want to people want to describe medieval people, oh, you know, they only drank small beer, which was low ABV, and it's like, no, okay, you know what? Everybody likes to get a little tipsy.
Yeah,
Like, they like to get a little tipsy.
And we could debunk too. It's probably another time, but debunk the whole thing about, oh well, they made the beer because the water wasn't safe to drink. It's like, okay, again, there's an element of this.
Oh,
You can't make beer with dirty water. It doesn't matter how much
no.
you're boiling it; it's still going to be disgusting, and people are
You know,
still.
I've
gonna
always
drink
wondered
it.
about that one, but
No,
I've never exactly
It's
heard
just,
the definitive note to
it's
that.
such
No.
nonsense. Medieval people absolutely drank water. I mean, they absolutely drank
Yeah.
water. But there's also this idea. There are definitely some speakers and some minds at the time who would say drink beer over water in certain
Yes.
absolutely.
circumstances. So Hildegard von Bingen was one, and she said, particularly in the winter and the snow is melting, to reach for ale. But they definitely drank water. But we
Mm.
do know that they did have some conception of water
Oh
and
yeah,
disease, as
Okay.
to kind of circle back to blaming
completely.
people who were Jewish for
Um,
poisoning the wells and that causing disease. If water caused disease, then it was because of poison and not
yeah, someone
necessarily
had done
because,
something. Yeah,
yeah.
Right.
But I mean, people are smart. They're not stupid. They have this idea: dead body in water, probably don't drink the water.
yeah,
They're not dumb,
Well, we'd hope.
but
Yeah.
you know, they don't have germ theory. They don't
yeah,
I
understand
was
that
gonna say
these
yes.
tiny microorganisms are
Yes.
causing disease. I
yeah.
mean, they blamed the Black Death was also blamed on sort of poison air,
I
and
was gonna
that's why they
say
had
it's all about
sweet
the
smelling
air, right?
things, and
Yes.
yeah, oh,
Exactly.
and then of course God being very mad.
Mm.
Absolutely. Although that said, since
Naturally.
again they don't know about yeast, so that no one's
Yes.
100% sure what is the magic that's
It's the
making
magic
the beer
stick.
happen exactly. So it's not that there's
Ah.
nothing to it, but it's
No, it's just not
do
quite the
we
way that we've been
over
sold it.
do
It's
we
the magic stick.
overemphasize things? Yeah, but a magic stick is important. I mean,
Very important magic stick.
absolutely.
Can
That
I
was a
also have
great
a magic
tangent.
stick? Can I also have one of those, please? Thanks. Take
You're
one.
right.
Stick.
Amazon Prime. So are we then nicely segueing into broomsticks here? Is that
Well,
where we're going?
first I want to finish, because there is one more thing, because I think the most
Yeah.
compelling argument for where the hats come from
Right.
is that there was actually a popular hat from the 16th and 17th century that looks basically exactly like a witch's hat. It could be flat on the top, but it's got a brim like this, and it's black and it's pointy, and it could be, like I said, flattened up here, but it's
Yeah.
I have pictures on my article,
We'll
so you
link
can
to
look at
that.
those,
Yeah.
and they're called Pharyngean and Capuchin hats. My pronunciation is probably brutal on that, because it's one of those words that you read but you don't hear out loud. So
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah, you never quite know.
so this hat was associated with Puritan costume in the years leading up to the English Civil War and in the age of the Commonwealth. So we know that this was a popular hat. And sometimes when they're depicting witches or alewives, they want to use something to give them an idea of difference. So they potentially use the hat to demonstrate that they were wearing older garb, that they were not in fashion, that this was not trendy, kind of mousy, not so there's that
Frumpy
argument there.
almost.
So there's
Yes.
that argument, which makes a lot of sense, considering when you see these pictures of these hats, you're gonna go, oh.
And especially, the association with
Yeah.
the Puritans, even when they were in power, they were still kind of the other. Because, let's be honest, they were boring people, except for when they did awful, violent things. So it's kind of, it's like the worst of both worlds. But that's the thing, they were never fashionable. They were always, it's very sort of, almost otherworldly in some ways. They have different beliefs. They have different, very different, very not fun approach to life. So it's a whole lot of things to unpack there.
So it might be that it may be an amalgamation of two ideas. I think the most compelling are the anti-Semitism, which was also worn by heretics, and then sort of the Puritan hat. And the two of them, since it looked quite similar, might have just merged into the pointy hat, and that's where we get the pointy hat. But needless to say, by just disproving this one, the whole thing goes up in the air.
Oh sure.
But
sure.
but we'll look into brooms and cats for funsies.
Oh yeah.
Of course. But now, so let me just see if I've understood everything correctly, right? The Puritans and basically the Jews, like people didn't like any of them. Okay. So because there might have been some similarities in terms of style or in terms of what they were wearing, it could have been amalgamated. And because there was already some sort of a stigma, I guess, to both of them, is that maybe part of the reason why it could have been joined?
Well, the
Or did I not quite?
Jewish people that wore the hats did not wear them because they wanted to.
Oh,
It
sure.
was forced on them by decree in certain circumstances, and it was also something that they forced heretics to wear. So that was not something that was culturally desirable by the people at the time.
Yes.
Whereas those other hats were at the time, popular within their circles. They were quite popular. There's lots of images of wealthy and noble European women and also men wearing these hats. There's loads of paintings. So it is quite a popular hat. So there's a possibility that later on,
yes,
they used either the hat to represent that these women were wearing an outdated fashion, possibly associated with Puritans, that was not appealing to the masses at the time, or also that they were wearing the pointy hat, which was associated with heretics and this violent anti-Semitism. And it is possible that they found using the pointy black hat representative of both ideas, and then it sort of fit their purposes perfectly. But I do think it probably comes from just using an outdated hat.
Yeah, and then I think too, then you wrap it up with 18th century printing where it's cheap. They're going to reprint the same thing again and again and again. The same images
that makes sense.
over different songs, different chapbooks, but they'll just use the same blocks because that's cheap, or they'll just keep using the same linoprint. Like it's all
I mean, if you've
linotype, all those things. Not sorry, linotypes later, but woodcuts. Sorry, but yeah, you're going to keep using the same things because it's cheap. So once that image is out there, you're keep using it. It's
there. I mean, if you've ever seen some of like early Disney works, you'll see a lot of the same kind of characters used over and over again, and a lot of the same mannerisms. So, I mean, reuse is a really valid reason, or a very valid cause of things being like prevalent, I guess, throughout time. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Oh, word. Okay, so hats basically, hats are not a thing, guys. No, hats are not a thing. And actually, men wore them too.
Yep.
Anyone still wear hats? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So how on earth do we get to broomsticks?
Right. So what I've seen floating around is that the witches riding brooms comes from the alewives' ale stake. And an ale stake was like a pole of sorts that could have potentially had a garland or a bush attached for signaling the sale of ale. This is false. Okay,
straight up. Yeah,
there's just nothing here.
Okay.
So witches are portrayed as riding brooms, but all manner of sticks, staffs, shovels, tridents, pitchforks. They weren't limited to the broom.
Oh no.
And
okay. And in
all my research,
is that a modern witch thing that it's always a broom?
We're gonna get to that.
Okay.
I'm building.
We're building. Yes. Flying.
So an ale stick might qualify as a stick or staff, but in my research, I have yet to see ale staff specifically referenced as a flying device for witches in any of the early modern or medieval primary sources I've been investigating. That is a shout out. If anyone has seen that, please send it to me because that is really interesting.
Yeah.
If you find one.
Yeah. Email us, tweet us, Facebook us, Instagram us. We'll have all the links down below.
Yes, because being wrong is not bad. We love new evidence.
Yes,
new evidence.
Yes. I want to be as accurate as possible. So if you disagree with me, send me a reason why.
Yes.
With primary sources.
There. Yes. Exactly.
Primary sources.
Exactly. As a former archivist, yes, primary sources.
Primary sources.
Okay, for the uninitiated, what is a primary source?
Oh, that is a good question.
A really good question. Yes. The archivists want to take this one?
Oh, go on, yeah. So when you get all of those original manuscripts, all the sort of things people hand wrote back in the day, or when you get letters, when you get basically things before they're printed, although things that are printed can also be a primary source, depending
Okay.
on what it is you're trying to research. But
Yeah.
basically, all the original stuff that was sort of unfiltered, if you like.
Okay.
Although, again,
Right.
even when it's someone's journal, they've done a lot of filtering, so you have to do a
Right.
little interpretation. But the core,
Yes.
Everyone's biased, including
Exactly.
yourself, and no one's
Yes.
a reliable narrator. In fact, journals that are written by people are some of the most unreliable
Oh,
things
yeah.
because we just lie about ourselves and to ourselves and all sorts of things. So when I'm calling for a primary source or a source about an ale stake in a witch trial, I mean
Mhm.
the legal record
yeah, if you
of
can
the
find that
witch
original
trial that
newspaper,
says she was flying on her ale stake. That's what
Perfect.
I'm looking
Okay.
for.
Okay.
yeah,
So
and
if
there are
anybody has
people.
that, please send it because we'd
Oh,
love to be proven wrong or learn something
absolutely.
new anyway.
Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
there are
Yeah.
amazing transcripts of witch trials, and some
Oh, yeah.
crazy stuff comes up. Again, mostly by men, but sometimes like they'll interview a horse or a dog. Like it is
Yep. Oh, they
bonkers.
executed a pig once. They hung a
Oh
pig
yeah,
because it killed a baby. They're
What?
yeah. Oh
yeah.
Is
yeah.
it what?
There are people who specialize in this. Like you can get lost for years.
We could go on a long
Guys.
tangent about this.
Guys,
Oh,
how do you
yeah.
interview a horse?
What? But they did, didn't they? So
Oh, they did.
that's
They
the
did
thing.
all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
Oh my
What?
goodness.
You give it like, and it's the other weird thing, and I'm sorry, this is another tangent, but you unpack it like the Witchfinder General dude was actually like in his mid-20s, I want to say, something like that, and like very young, and off just decided he's like, I'm in charge now.
Yeah, and just
gonna go
made up
do
his credentials and just made up him. Oh, he's
And,
a
like,
terrible person.
was responsible for all these women being executed. But again, just because the
Because
sort of
he
confidence
decided
of
one day this was the
just
thing
a
he was going
dude
to do.
who's like, who can solve this problem? Me, based on
And
what,
I'm going to call myself the Witchfinder General.
yeah. So, but anyway, we
Good God, man. Oh
yeah.
my word.
Yeah. Although again,
the arrogance of men.
and it's so interesting though. And again, there are people who specialize in this, but like the way witches, and which I'm again I'm putting in air quotes, were treated in say England compared to Ireland are vastly different. Like completely
Really?
different approach, with a
Yes.
couple of exceptions, but
Okay.
Yes.
hugely different.
And even so Scotland's the worst. England didn't have very many witch trials compared to Scotland, and Ireland didn't have very many witch trials compared to both of them because the Irish had the Irish to scapegoat instead of actually needing witches. But that's a thing that we can
That's a
talk
whole
about
other
in the
story.
next episode because it's very the Continentals were the ones who were really gung-ho about the witch trials.
Really?
The Germans in particular really liked to burn and kill people who were
Was that
accused.
like directly related to a level of superstition?
So yes, and
Yeah, it's a yes and we can talk about that next week when we talk about the real ties because I feel like we don't want to get too much into that now because it's
Sure.
really complicated and it is definitely a yes and.
Okay.
but back to the sticks and the
Right.
brooms.
So the witches are actually depicted in riding animals. And this might be modeled on the followers of Diana. As I said before, the goddess Diana was really associated with witchcraft and with witches. And more to the point, witches were also depicted as flying with not the need of any instrument at all and just the devil-powered wind.
I want that so badly.
Oh, off they go. You don't
It's like
need
a great way to travel.
Yes.
No more commute time.
Yes.
No.
So in 1324, in the trial of Alice Keitler in the city of Kilkenny in Ireland, and if you go to Kilkenny, you can still go to Alice's public house and see where she lived, and it's really cool, and you can have a beer there. It's highly recommended.
Big black cat energy. We'll talk about cats later, though.
So the prosecution stated that, quote, in rifling through the closet of the lady, they found a pipe of ointment wherewith she greased a staff, upon which she ambled and galloped through thick and thin.
Oh, cool.
And the ointment is important.
Big deal.
It's really important. And it's something that people miss a lot when we talk about staffs. The ointment is an important part of the whole idea. Because in medieval thought, the medieval thinkers of the time, the medieval literati, commonly believed that witches couldn't actually fly at all. That this was completely denounced. Instead, they thought it was a hallucination brought on by the devil.
Ha!
We've all been
And,
there.
And for example, in the Corrector by Bouchard of Worms, the Bishop of Worms in the Holy Roman Empire, dating to 1008 to 1012, so this is really early, he talked about how witches could not actually fly. And in the very famous 1487 Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of the Witches, it's viewed that metamorphosis in any form was a demonic illusion. Quote, therefore, it is evident that demons cannot actually affect any permanent transformation in human bodies. That is to say, no real metamorphosis. So the idea that anyone is flying is generally believed to just be a hallucination. And this is where the ointment came in, because some scholars argue that there were hallucinogenics in the ointment. The ointment was actually something that people might have used, and there were hallucinogenics in the ointment, and that might have made them believe that they were doing these things. But this, of course, is one of those things that there's no consensus about.
Nope.
Right.
Hey, this is Bean, and you're listening to the Queer Ladies Podcast.
We're talking about brooms and how they've become associated with witches over time. So, Christina, let's go back to where you were.
So, why the broom? So the scholar Brian Levick has argued that the broom was associated with women, and its use might quote, therefore reflect nothing more than the preponderance of female witches. So because women use brooms,
that was enough of a connection?
It might be to some scholars. And as we talked about before, sometimes things just are. It's just what's handy and what's convenient. And it might just be a symbol because it reflected the large amounts of female witches. And actually we have an illustration from 1451, which might be the oldest extant images of witches on brooms. And I have that in my article, and it's a witch on a broom, and a witch on a stick. And again, you see no hats, just the garb of the day. So where did the concept of flying women originate? Why are they even flying? Where did this come from? So the idea that a witch was a night flyer was likely an amalgamation of several strands of folklore and an ecclesiastical conception that emerged in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, when monks created the image of the heretic as a, quote, secret, nocturnal, sexually promiscuous devil worshiper.
So basically...
all in one package.
Wow.
All the cool kids are...
Sounds fun. Sounds fun.
Yeah.
Let's go there. But not at that time.
Not at that time. No.
So this would fuse two distinct concepts in existence in Europe. Okay. So the first is the Strege, which dates the classical period. And the story here is that women transformed into a flying screech owl at night and devoured babies.
What? Why? Lord.
And then the second strand is that women who would leave their homes at night to follow Diana, the goddess Diana, on the wild hunt, also known as ladies of the night. And beliefs in both of these were powerful in commoners. Commoners believed that this was a thing.
Yeah, wild hunt, very popular, very big all across Europe. It's a hugely, trying to think of a good word for it, but sort of hugely, I guess, a sort of emblematic thing of, bad things happen at night. They're all out, it's always people who are either being punished or who are like unbelievers who are off, doomed to hunt forever. And, it's very big in Germanic cultures, but it's all across Europe, really. It's a big deal.
It was, women believed this so much that they even said that they did this. There were women going, yep, this is me. I'm up there. I'm on the wild hunt. Yep. What? Yep. That's me doing this. This is the thing.
But surely you didn't want to be associated with it. So why would you raise your hand and say, yep, absolutely, that was me. Last night, you saw me at 2 a.m.
Well, until the 14th century, scholars didn't believe this. So they thought it was a delusion of the devil. And you also have to remember that witch trials and burning witches aren't really a thing until the late medieval period and the early modern period. Like in early medieval period, they really didn't believe in witches. They thought that people who thought they were witches were it was just a delusion from the devil. These people weren't well. They were, the devil was hurting them. They were heretics maybe, but this virulent hatred of witches and this need to like burn vast swathes of the female population just wasn't there.
Yeah, it's a much later thing. Yeah.
So, when women were saying this early on, the scholars were going, no.
Yeah, they're like,
No.
you think that? No.
Aww. The
Yeah,
devil
it
is
actually
messing with you.
Exactly. It actually does kind of go from being like, oh, you need help to there's a lady who's scary and I'm not sure why, but I'm gonna do something about it. So it's a weird
Right.
It's a weird thing.
Yeah, it definitely completely shifts.
Yeah. And you can tie it into a lot of reasons. Like there's a whole shift in just the economics, everything that's happening at the time, lots of different things you could tie it into, but there's not like one thing that sort of tips it over the edge. It's a lot of things over a period of time. But yeah, it's just not the view earlier on.
Oh man, but
And
that's
we'll talk
history,
about-
isn't it? Right? Like lots of things over time. The context is everything.
Yeah. And we'll touch on that next week, especially when we'll talk about the links between alewives, witches, and economics.
Yeah, there's a story there, but we'll get into that later.
Yeah, we're getting that. We're getting into that one later in the month. In fact, that one's going to be great.
For all those people who are excited about economic history, but no, it's really cool. Come join us. Yes,
it is. It's really interesting.
It's witches and beer. It's great.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and the story's not told enough, so we're gonna bring it.
Yeah.
So, and more important than anything else is that the witch with the stick or the staff or the trident or the pitchfork predates the demonization of alewife in art and literature. So this idea of the witch with this stake or staff or anything of the like is in existence way before we start seeing really negative depictions of alewives. So this is an early thing. This was not created by alewives. This is before them. So we have this is before we start demonizing alewives, I should say.
Yeah.
Right.
So, for example, in an anonymous 13th century poem, we have, indeed, he adds, it would be a wondrous thing to see a woman riding a calf or a broomstick or a poker over mountains and villages. So this is way before the demonization of alewives, which happens sort of more towards the later medieval period. So broom and witchcraft, not to do with alewives.
Also not a thing.
Not a thing?
Not a thing.
So no hats, no brooms. What have we got? What have we got left? Cats.
This is my favorite. This is my favorite because it gets so absurd. Oh my god, the misogyny is so strong in this one.
But I mean, absurd. Okay, so absurdity is really fun. Misogyny, not so much. But yeah, let's do it.
This will make your eyes roll so hard. It is so ridiculous.
Okay. So should we then say that every time we are going to have a bit of an eye roll, we should have a little sip of our drink? Like just for the funsies. We'll probably be wasted. Fine. When you feel like it. But if you're listening along.
No, that's okay. You can play every time.
Please do. Yes, if you're listening at home, don't drive, but
no.
Hopefully no one's driving anywhere in this,
No, let's hope not. Okay, great. So let's get into cats, right? How on earth are cats related to modern witches? Or the stereotype of modern witches?
Well, they're actually tied to heretics. So,
of course,
so in the medieval period, cats are associated with heresy, and there's so many sources for that. But they're really only rarely linked with witchcraft in the Middle Ages. It's not really until the early modern period that we kind of see the exclusive link. So, for example, they were associated with the devil. So there's just this wonderful scholar, and I really, really recommend her books if you get their hands on Kathleen Walker-Meikle. Meikle. Oh, I'm so sorry, I butchered your name. I'm terrible.
We can link it though below. Like we can get the link and put it down below for anyone that's interested.
Yeah. Cites an example of the 12th century French theologian Alain de Lille, who, quote, claimed the very name Cathars came from cats and that they worshipped a black cat, the devil in disguise, and would kiss its bottom during service.
very big deal when we're talking about the Cathars. This is one of the biggest things leveled against them. It's a whole thing.
It's a huge thing. It's of course complete bullshit.
Yeah, it's all just
sure.
made up.
And it's propaganda designed to frighten and horrify the general population because the Cathars were heretical and this was really scary. And so, yes, they did all this Satan worshiping stuff. And this idea that they were worshiping a cat is something that we also see in the trial of the Templars.
It's all tied together.
And
not tied together in the way that people who want it to be tied together is tied together. Sorry. Yes. But it's a real thing.
They're drawn pictures.
Yes.
Okay.
Right, but this association with the cat is and the devil actually way predates, of course, Alewives and the witch trials. It's associated with heresy, and the Templars were accused many times of worshiping a cat. I taught a class at Trinity about the trial of the Templars and the amount of times this came up. Yeah.
And this time you do get men involved too, who are, on the receiving end of this. It's unfortunately it's everyone. But
okay.
So and it was a common accusation against heretics. The association with cats and heresy and eventual witchcraft was argued by Walker-Meikle that it had to do with their being both domestic and wild. So this idea that they were disloyal.
Okay. Unlike dogs, right?
Yeah. So its natural instincts were for them to venture out and leave. So Hildegard von Bingen, for example, referred to them as, quote, unfaithful. And Chaucer's Mansiple's Tale from the 14th century story collection, the Canterbury Tales, the cat is depicted as the one who could have the most luxurious trappings, the best house, so nice, cushy, wonderful, but it would still abandon its owner to chase a mouse.
Most cat owners value that in their cats.
And if you are a brewer, again, it does all tie together. You want the cat to be getting rid of the mice who are going to be in there trying to get at your malt. That's that's not a thing you want.
But clearly, something like independence and independent thought was almost at attack here, right? Like the fact that cats sort of thought for themselves and weren't sort of slaves to when they got fed, like that's almost what was being attacked. It sounds like this.
It's this idea of it occupies a liminal space. So it's not quite domestic and it's not quite wild, and they can't control it as much. And, for medieval thinkers, control, particularly of these sorts of things, was really important. Anything occupying liminal spaces was dangerous. It didn't quite fit into a box. Now that's not to say that people didn't keep them as pets, because they absolutely did.
Right.
And it wasn't a rare thing to keep pets. In the medieval period, people kept dogs, apes, squirrels.
Yeah. Oh, crazy stuff, yeah.
Oh, yeah, singing birds.
Yeah, you get cats walled up, though, in medieval buildings. That they would have been put there as kind of a sort of ritual. Ritual is a real thing here, though, kind of ritual deposit to kind of guard the house. We think lots of other things could have been protecting.
Alive or dead, Lisa? Alive or dead?
It depends.
You've got Schrodinger's wool cats here.
Yeah,
oh my God.
You kind of get ones that were, clearly not, went in alive. But again, it's there's a whole sort of spectrum of folk belief to do with cats that we can trace back, certainly through the early, through sort of late medieval period, and and even into the early modern, and kind of into today. It's still all there. But they get the. They get the rough end of the stick in a lot of it. So I know
they fell from grace. I mean, my goodness, compared to Egyptian times and stuff.
Oh, we're the gods. Yeah.
What the hell happened? Honestly,
they never really held a high place in European continental culture.
Yeah.
Okay.
They were always kind of viewed in a shady way. But then again, this is en masse.
Right.
Certain specific people didn't have the same idea. But now everybody prepare to roll your eyes, because I'm going to talk about something really depressing and very angering.
Okay, get your drink ready.
Get your drink ready.
Yeah.
And this is about female pet keeping in general. So women who kept pets in the early modern period and in the medieval period. And this was something that just created a lot of anxiety for male thinkers.
Why?
So
Reason.
They're dumb. So, because of misogyny. So Professor Erica Fudge, she's an expert in Renaissance animals and their relationships to humans. And she says, obviously this was really misogynistic. And she said, quote, attacks on female pet keeping implied a number of things. Without a firm male hand, the woman would make such a mental dissent that she would disregard the differences between species and show herself to be close to the beast. That she might, perhaps even more subversively, misrecognize the role of man to such an extent that an animal is felt to be able to fill his place. And that instead of reclaiming perfection, she would reenact Eve's temptation by the devil and make the animals not merely wild, but satanic.
That's amazing.
Oh, man.
So, in short, women and pets were thought to be a particularly dangerous combination.
Oh my God! So just basically anti-men. Like that was it. Women got pets because they didn't respect, I don't know, men's roles, and they replaced them with pets, right? Basically.
Well, no. It's because a woman could a woman could mistake her pet for her husband.
Honestly,
I mean,
and her tiny little lady brain.
Little lady brains. Yeah.
Couldn't work out the difference between the pet and the husband without a firm male hand. She needs a firm male hand with pet keeping.
But in order for her to understand the difference between the man and the cat.
Well, it's just difficult, right? I mean, you know.
It is kind of hard. I mean, they're vastly different sizes, but you're definitely going to confuse them.
Yep. I mean, I can't tell my dog from my husband. My husband's 6'4", my dog's like maybe 12 inches tall, but nope, no clue who's who.
Same. Yep.
Said, medieval and early modern Europe aren't a monolith. And different cities and regions and stuff did not agree with this and had different relationships with felines.
So there'll be nuance.
Yes. So early medieval Ireland is actually a really good example of that. Cats had a really high value. There's actually even law tracts specifically about cats called the cat sections. And a cat was valued at 3 cows if he could hunt mice. And this is not nothing. That's a significant amount.
Yeah.
That's
anything.
Really, that's
cattle
high.
are a big deal in medieval Ireland. Like everything goes
big
back to cattle.
doings.
Cattle are a big deal in many cultures. I mean, from South African kind of lobola, paying for brides, kind of.
Sure.
It's not that crude, but cattle are worth a lot.
Oh,
even now. Yeah.
So it's important when I'm saying these things that I'm very clear that I'm not talking about everyone and I'm not talking about everywhere.
Totally.
Because there are absolutely exceptions. And early medieval Ireland has a lot of exceptions to a lot of this misogyny that you'll see other places. It's just not there in medieval Ireland. They have their own flavor of misogyny, we'll say.
Where was it the worst, Christina?
Oh God,
that's a hard
continental
question.
Europe tends to be bad with these kind of things, but again, it's really, really town specific, village specific.
Okay.
A lot of these continental authors are writing things in one place, and then it's going to get picked up in England, or it's going to get picked up in Scotland. It's more, I can tell you where law tracts say something's different. So I can definitely tell you in medieval Ireland there are different ideas. Now, again, a lot of times when we're talking about law tracts, we're talking about ideas. So whether these laws were actually enforced or not is a bit different. So a lot of times when these people are writing these laws or these writings, doesn't mean everyone's agreeing with them. It just means that there's this thinker that's out there. The idea might be popular. It might not be. And medieval history is just a very big game of guesswork. Like we can't ever say anything for certain in medieval history because people are unreliable. We don't really know how popular an idea was. So we can say that these things are here and we can make guesses based on what the surrounding material is. But I can't tell you for certain how prevalent this idea of cats being awful is among common everyday people. I can tell you that appears very common as a reason why to prosecute heretics, which tells us at a legal level, they're using it in a way to gain convictions.
And we're only dealing with what we have. I mean, that's the thing. The historical record is already biased just based on what records were created, what was kept. It's that doesn't make it a bad thing. It's just that's what you have to work with, and you have to sort of try to balance those inherent things that just are with, what else can you find out? Whether, again, that's through archaeology, through folklore, through, there's a lot of other things you can use as that can help you infer other things. But like Christina's saying, it's still kind of a guess. You're just, using the evidence you have to kind of weigh up what fits the pattern most. How can you, weigh it up? And then too, when you look at it through the lens of sort of like, even like late 19th, early 20th century researchers, there's always this idea of wanting to have these kind of pan-European things that sort of harken back to, whether it's sort of, survival of paganism, etc. There's no real evidence for most of that, but it's an idea that was so prevalent that we still have it very much in modern culture, because that's what sort of early 20th century scholars said. So it must be right? And and then it gets sort of, you see that all throughout sort of the 20th century, and like the Nazis were very into this kind of idea. And so we still see it through kind of, even like, in like a Steven Spielberg lens, that kind of thing turns up in like Raiders of the Lost Ark. None of these things were actually necessarily based on a real, survival of a particular tradition or whatever, but that doesn't mean there weren't little things here and there that maybe did, get through, but we don't have records for them or real evidence for them. So it's tricky.
Right. And like circling back to like the medieval Templars, like the whole trial was a farce. It was basically there because, the king owed them a lot of money at the time, and he decided he didn't really feel like paying that.
Yep.
So he took them to trial and accused them of all sorts of things. And initially the trial wasn't particularly popular, especially among the clergy. They were like, yeah, no, we're not really into this. This is not really a thing that we're going to be doing.
Because they knew it could have been them on the block next, because, that's,
right.
Whoever's got money.
Yeah. And then he just kind of pushed through it. But, the Templars would confess under torture, and then they'd recant. And again, the church was kind of like, really not here for this, really, really not into this. But eventually, the king got his convictions. But, how many lay people believed that the Templars were this bad? We don't really know, because it was really kind of a noble thing. It was really kind of the elite having a go at the other elite. So unfortunately, we just don't have as many sources from the common people due to just the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
So now, how do you think that these kind of like threads that have been touted as the truth, these sort of stereotypes, how do you think it's harmed anything? How's it harmed the stereotype of witches? How's it harmed the stereotype of women in beer? Like, what is the effect of this, actually?
That's a really good question. Yeah, and we'll probably unpack some of the sort of how it's harmed women in beer in the next one, just so some of the economic changes and what happened over sort of the, from that period where all women were brewing to suddenly where no women were brewing. So that's a whole other one to unpack, but it's, oh gosh, yeah, Christina, over to you first. I think I'm gonna think a while.
So I guess we can talk about like modern impact. So I think anytime we have something that's false within our modern consciousness, and it just keeps getting repeated and repeated, it's detrimental. It's detrimental to the people who repeat it. It's detrimental to the people who talk about it. It creates mistrust between writers and readers. It creates this idea of, oh, I trusted you, and this is not true. And what does that mean? And especially when we're talking about reliable sources. And again, I'm going after the big guy here, not the smaller bloggers, because you should be able to trust those people.
Yeah.
And actually, I will send in our show notes, I'll have a link down below, because there's a professor in the US who's actually looked and researched the beginning of this rumor, where it all began. And as it was just kind of a thrown together thing, and there was no evidence for it, and it's just kind of gotten repeated and repeated.
Yeah.
And that this is really dangerous, because particularly in the medieval, and I'm going to go off on a little tangent here, but
your podcast friend.
Particularly with medieval history, we're actually fighting a really virulent strand of white supremacy who's using medieval history as a way to further their bullshit. And they're just they're talking about how European medieval history was just white and there was no people of color, which is bullshit. Conceptions of race are very different in the medieval period than they are now. Race was more based on language, shared culture, these things. You're more likely to have racism towards someone of a different religion, or not racism, or prejudice towards someone of a different religion than you are to have someone who looks very different to you but practices the same religion than you are. It's just a completely, and also people probably more closely identify with their city and their locality than their country. Like this idea of a country, of course, I mean, we're not even talking about places that had countries. This conception of statehood is very different. This conception of identity is very different. You're more likely to identify as a Dubliner, but not even a Dubliner, a Viking Dubliner, or an Irish Dubliner, or an English Dubliner, and within your community, and that's your community. And so you're going to be suspicious of other people. And we'll kind of get into that in more depth. So this conception of like us as a nation versus other people as a nation is something that, I mean, there's so much research on this and when it was created and why it was created. And it's
and people have always moved around all the time. They're just like, you know, for as much as people like to be like, oh no one ever left my hometown until whatever, World War I. No, it's bullshit. It was true in certain individual cities or again towns, but people have always traveled huge distances, whether it's for trade or whether they just fancied going somewhere else. Like we don't always know the reasons, but there have always been people just popping up at a different place from where they were born. We can see that throughout all, the whole archaeological record. There's never like a monolithic culture, even where there are groups that have a lot of similarities. People are always moving around. It's a thing. It's always happened.
And they pick sides based on who they like. Like within Dublin, there's the whole Battle of Clontarf, and the mythos is, oh, it was the Vikings versus the Irish. Bullshit. It was the Vikings on both sides and the Irish on both sides fighting each other. And the Vikings and the Irish became amalgamated. They intermarried, they had fosterage, they adopted each other's children, they did all this stuff to the point where some scholars argue at some point you couldn't tell the Irish from the Vikings. And the idea of being associated with like natal kin, or your uxorial kin, your married kin, who do you identify with more? In medieval Ireland, it was more likely that women identified with their natal kin than who they married into. They would not pick their husband over their father and their mother, and because their father could divorce them from their current husband and they could get married again to another partner based on what the politics of the day needed. So they're more likely to actually have this bond with their natal kin than a husband who might be replaced. So the idea
I see big
of family,
eyes, yes.
That is so different. I mean, it's fascinating how different it is to today.
And there are scholars who will argue against that, but
sure. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. We don't talk about this, and that's why, to Christina's point, why it's so important to get to the real history, because the real stuff is so interesting and so multi-layered and so much more diverse and in some ways strange to us than we're used to talking about. We like to have things in a sort of, oh, it was like this, but only slightly different. No, some things are just bonkers to our eyes, and that's okay. But it's important to know what was actually happening, and all that good stuff.
And when we're talking about medieval alewives, I have several problems with the idea, because first of all, it centers a European female alewife in this discussion of women who brewed beer, when we know, like, for example, women in Peru have been brewing beer in a high status way for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries. And
women in Africa too.
Exactly.
And in Asia as well. And we need to stop saying, oh, medieval, because the medieval period happened, throughout the world. So we need to be really careful with our language. And also, I don't want to erase the fact that the modern witch depiction definitely has some virulent anti-Semitism to it. And when we just say it was alewives, we're kind of erasing that. And that's not okay to do. We need to really understand that there are some harmful things that influence the way that we look at the world, and maybe we don't understand that now and it's divorced from that or whatever, but knowing the beginnings of this is important. And also the virulent misogyny that existed in the medieval period. We don't need to have it associated with alewives to know that it was extremely misogynistic and that it caused the death of, tens of thousands of women who were accused of witches. And we don't need that alewife, that interesting, that seductive story to make this just horrible. We can also say that this is horrible. We don't need that link, I don't think.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Yeah, it takes away from what they were doing, what they were achieving, and it's important to say, there were a lot of things they weren't allowed to do, they couldn't do because of society and all of that. But again, it's they did a lot at the same time, and you're sort of taking that away if you're like, oh, well, they tried to do stuff, but they were oppressed. Well, no, you're talking hundreds of years, individual lives, people, men and women, or people across whatever spectrum, did all kinds of cool stuff and all kinds of bad stuff. And you have to be able to, unpack all these gray areas, but also acknowledge that, maybe, Mother Redcap or whomever was making some, bitch and ale, and everyone really loved it. And, no one was like, and she's also a witch. I mean, that might have happened later, and she might have been the local cunning woman. We'll talk probably more about that in another one. But, it's also, there are all these layers of sort of identity tied up with it. It doesn't have to just be about what was taken away, but also celebrating what was there.
And it's just not true that women throughout Europe were removed from ale brewing or beer brewing at the same time.
Yeah.
And like my book that's eventually going to come out, I swear I'm working on it. It's going to talk about how different the case is in Ireland. Like in England, we do know that women were removed from brewing when it became popular with men, and we'll talk about that next week as well. But it's just not the case in Ireland. And we know that women were brewing, and much later, and in a much, bigger fashion early, and then much more prevalently later on. And it's dangerous when we make sweeping judgments, because we're erasing, as Lisa said, really importantly, all the women who succeeded and survived. You don't necessarily, I mean, of course they had these horrible circumstances in which they existed, right? Like we know medieval society in Europe, very misogynistic in nature, but some women still managed to flourish within that. And we don't need to erase their stories. As Lisa said, it's really important that we talk about them and we don't forget them.
Exactly.
But it sounds anyway as if we've just kind of brushed this with a very kind of black and white filter. We've lost the gray, we've lost the nuance, and that happens all the time.
Oh yeah.
Modern stories are also just portrayed to be black and white. Whether you're talking politics or economics or anything, it's just so it's so bipolar in a sense, and that's really not the right picture.
No,
there's so much in between there.
No, and really, frankly, anyone that's talking about history in black and white terms is just really doing a disservice to the field, because history is just not the case. We really can't say for certain. Like I can make arguments based on what I think is the most compelling evidence that supports what I think. We call it meaningful conclusions based on the evidence. But I strongly argue that you really can't say for certain anything, because you can't get inside someone's head. You don't really know what they were thinking. You don't really know why they did the things that they did.
And you can only work with the evidence you've got, right?
Exactly.
You can only work with the records that you've got, and those are always going to be partial, biased, and you're got to just try and fill in the gap somewhere.
Everyone's biased.
Oh,
there's just no way you can completely remove your bias. And if you think you can, then steer fair and far away from anyone who says that they're not biased.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Everyone just has to own, like, here's the part I see it. This is why I see it that way. And that's okay. It's okay to own all of that and say, well, so here's my best take on it based on these things. And again, there's always bits you're not admitting to, or that you're just like, you can't even see that you're doing it. And that's okay. That's for other scholars to come in and say, okay, but, and that's kind of the whole point of sort of what you're doing, like real historical discourse. You want people to challenge your ideas, and you want people to say, but what about this? Or have you seen that way? Build on it, instead of just kind of being like, this person on high said X, they must be right.
And the whole point is actually to come out. Like I spent an entire chapter in my PhD talking about, here's my bias, here's where I'm coming from, this is my theoretical framework, here is where I'm working with. So it is important not only to acknowledge it, but to own it, to come in and saying, like, and I'll say this right now, I'm a feminist and I'm a theorist. So I'm coming at things from a theoretical perspective. I want to pull everything apart to the tiniest bit that I can. I like to deconstruct everything. And I also don't like to reach facts. I'm not a facts person. I'm a meaningful conclusions person, which drives a lot of traditional historians absolutely crazy. But yeah, I'm very much owning what I am and my approach to things. And I think that you need to do that. I think that you need to say, hey, I'm a socialist. I'm an anarchist. I'm whatever. I'm a postmodernist. Whatever your approach is, own it. Big, bright neon sign in the beginning. So that way when people read your work, they're kind of knowing what they're getting into. I mean, there's entire historians who are just devoted to tearing apart people's biases in works. I spent a lot of time in my thesis just tearing apart Victorian bias in their works because they don't like to. They have no bias. I'm a middle class Victorian man. I have no bias. My opinions are facts.
I have rescued all of these things from where they were in, the benighted people of wherever, and put them where my fellow, rich, white people could see them.
Yes,
that probably seemed like
I found all these bones in this Viking burial, and I chucked them all in the bin except for the head, so I can do phrenology.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's the thing. The way we do these things changes, and it's important to say what you did, how you did it, and why these were your conclusions. And again, it's okay for other people to come on later and be like, well, hang on, now we know X, but unless you're working with the how you got there, it's tricky.
I have to tell you, as a philosophy major, and I used to teach critical thinking, this was the thing that drove me mad, because it was the one thing I really struggled to teach to people, was to actually remove the bias and remove the filter and be like, objectively, in any possible world, is this true? And therefore, to think about it, removed from your bias, removed from your sociological status, removed from your perspective, and to only examine the core of what you were saying. Whereas in most cases, when you're reading the newspaper, I mean, who does that? But when you read in the newspaper, when you're listening to somebody speak, when you're looking at a historian's perspective, or whatever the case is, you're very much inclined to look at their perspective and their, where they came from, and you're very much inclined to look at how that might affect what they're saying. Now, it may affect things, and it could affect things negatively or positively, but it used to drive me mad trying to teach people objective truth when that's the stuff you got to get rid of. But that's also the stuff that you need to make everyday good judgments. Like, every day you need to be able to look at context and be almost empathetic and look from other people's shoes and say, did they do this from this intention or that intention? But man, when you talk about logical truth, that doesn't count at all. Crazy.
No, it's hard.
That's mad. So basically, we're saying now, Christina and Lisa, that the modern witch stereotype, pointy hat, black cat, broom, not so linked necessarily to alewives, or at least not as clearly as what we thought, right?
Not at all. There's no links. We'll talk about next week the links between actual witchcraft or magic practice and brewing beer and alewives, but the modern witch stereotype is just not from medieval alewives. It's just not. It's and here I go saying I don't like facts, but here I'm going telling you, no, this is not a thing. But no, it's not a thing.
Yeah. No, and we'll get into it next. The next time we have this discussion, we can talk about the folk belief and folk practice and the magic stuff. There's stuff there. It's just
absolutely.
Oh man, it's just not this. Yeah,
there's absolutely links between alewives and witches. It's just not a depiction, right? It's not like the pointy hat, and it's more of the lived experience, and we'll talk about that. Yeah, next week.
Yeah, awesome.
Exactly.
I mean, that's really it. And I mean, I think for the listeners and the viewers at home, what's really important is that we're going to be doing these kinds of historical deep dives every month, maybe once, maybe twice. We'll see how the schedule goes. But, there is always going to be some sort of interesting connection between beer and history, and especially women in history, right? Like, and
Exactly.
Christina and Lisa, you
Oh,
guys
yes.
are the experts on this one.
But
You'll
we're gonna
get to
mix
hear
it
me
up.
ranting.
We'll do
Love
ranting,
it.
but we're going to mix it up. There's going to be other things.
Yep.
We're going to do different formats. There's going to be
Yes.
people who are going to be less angry, but also more angry. It's all good. We're going to have
Yeah,
it all.
we're gonna do fun stuff too.
mixed
It's
up.
not all gonna be
Yep.
intense. We're gonna do, beer cocktails, the history of beer cocktails, and just some more fun stuff. Maybe we'll talk. I mean, I made a malt tonic earlier this year. Maybe we'll
that was
talk
cool.
about malt tonics.
Gotta
Actually,
do
we
it.
should definitely talk about malt tonics. So
Yeah.
it's not all necessarily going to be heavy, depressing, misogynistic history.
Yeah, no, we can all just do like fun historical homebrewing too, and say, "Hey, look, we made a beer and it didn't explode." Unlike so many modern beers, like we could do a whole thing just on like your beer shouldn't explode. This is a baseline, like you have failed if
Guys,
your
I've
beer
never
explodes.
had a beer explode. I feel like a failed homebrew. Like
I had professional commercial brewed beer explode in my kitchen.
That is
That's true.
unacceptable.
It
The
is
same
actually true.
brewery.
Yeah,
I'm not saying
that's
who.
true.
I know
No,
we're being
not
not
very
yet.
we're being very good, but no.
I'm not saying who, but I'm not impressed.
No, exactly. So I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to wrap it up here. We're going to link any of the articles, images, things, stuffs, everything that Christina and Lisa have written on the subject are going to be linked below. Show notes, descriptions, whatever we got. We're also going to link social profiles. So
Yes, give us a follow on all the things. We will
yeah, exactly. Give us
And
a
ask
follow.
us questions. And if you have suggestions for further like history deep dives that you want, you're interested in, you want to know more, let us know. Let us research it. That's what we're here for.
Yes,
exactly. And if we get
absolutely.
like weird misogynistic crap, we're just going to block it because we don't have
Yeah.
time for that in our lives. So,
Life's too short.
Life is way
Exactly.
too short.
I don't care.
But if you want to have a real discussion about all the history stuff, bring it. We love that.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And as for the Beer Ladies podcast as a whole, we're going to mix it up. We've got various things, interviews with interesting people. We've got general kind of casual chit chat. We're a group of ladies and we're going to kind of rotate every week. So there'll be a couple of different faces every week, but we're aiming to release weekly and we're going to have interesting conversations, however serious they might get. And they're all going to be kind of beer themed. But I'll tell you what is coming up next week. Next week for realsies is coming up seasonal beers. So beers to drink for Halloween, guys.
Ooh,
What do we love at Halloween,
like
autumn,
ghosts?
fall?
Dracula!
There we go. It's spooky
I also have
season, right?
Dracula. Yes.
Dracula.
Oh,
Dracula.
Thandi, show them your shirt.
Oh my gosh.
Oh.
Okay.
Yes.
I have a shirt. It's my pumpkin ale shirt. And my one says, pumpkin ale is like Marmite. You either love it or you're wrong.
And for those who are just listening, Thandi has some amazing beer-themed art on her shirts that are available for sale. They're fantastic.
Thank you.
Go and buy.
Yes,
They're amazing. She's so creative.
Oh,
we
thanks,
love Thandi. Thandi designed all of our art as well for the podcast.
Amazing.
So
yay!
Big ups to Thandi. I'm just so blown away.
It's always a pleasure to do interesting designs, guys. Always fun.
Here. And I think too, we should summarize again for folks. We're all based here in Dublin, so you'll hear a lot about Irish beer. We're very excited about the local scene, but we also have a really global outlook since many of us are from all over the place. So we're going to be talking to people from other places, repping beers we love from wherever they are. But again, we want to give a shout out to all the locals.
Totally. And if there are any suggestions for any future shows, email us, Facebook, message us, Instagram, message us, do all the things. Slide into our DMs. We're going to be watching, listening, doing all the stuff. And if you enjoyed this, really share it with a person that you think also might enjoy it. That's kind of the number one. Rate, subscribe, like it, do all the stuff. Guys, how's your beer? Should we have a cheers for the last bits?
Oh yes, I switched beers. Now I'm drinking
which
drops. No Fury.
Look how beautiful that is.
It's so psychedelic. It's a Helles.
Oh, it's a Helles. Oh, I love a Helles.
Lovely.
Nice and refreshing. You're on the lagers today. Very nice. Love it. Are you still in your dark mild, Lisa?
I am. It's a school night, so I got to go easy. So again, highly recommend this if you just need something that's perfect.
Do you know I still haven't found it? Like I need to find it. I need to order it and
order it directly from them. They'll
that's what I'm
bring
gonna
it to you.
That's what
I love Four Provinces. Their lager is just out of this world.
I can't wait till they can open again. They're putting in a beer engine in their pub, so hopefully soon.
We need to go back. Yeah.
Okay. Road trip.
Oh my gosh, when we went there before for the brewery tour. It was amazing. Their toasted sandwiches were so good.
Yum. Ladies, we'll see you next week or the week after. We'll see you whenever we're podcasting again.
Wonderful.
Love you, friends.
Bye, friends.
Bye.